Hi, my name is Valerie Varan. I'm a licensed professional counselor, a holistic life coach, and I specialize in working with spiritually transformative experiencers. I also am a quantum psychology pioneer, and I'm author of the book Living in a Quantum Reality, using quantum physics and psychology to embrace your higher consciousness. With me today are Norman Klaunig and Kristi Otis, which I'm so glad to be able to connect with, and I'll be reading their bios, introducing them to you in a moment. But we recently met through the International Association for Near-Death Studies, and we realized that as professional counselors who work with clients, we really had a lot to talk about. So welcome, you guys.
Hi, great to be here.
Oh,
Oh, wonderful. So let me tell you a little bit about Kristi and Norman. Kristi is a licensed professional counselor, a national certified counselor, a clinical, a certified clinical trauma professional, and a grief recovery method specialist with over 20 years of clinical experience. She is also an evidential psychic medium, a spiritual teacher, and an intuitive life coach. She bridges psychology and spirituality to help individuals heal from all kinds of things, including grief, anxiety, trauma, life transitions, and especially transpersonal and spiritually transformative experiences. She's the founder and CEO and a clinical therapist at Friendswood Counseling Center, where she provides counseling for teens and adults. And she also founded Kristi Otis LLC, where she offers her psychic and mediumship readings, soul readings, spiritual mentoring, and intuitive life coaching. So much fun, Kristi. So to learn more about her or to book a reading, visit kristiotis.com or friendswoodcc.com, and I'll make sure I post that for all of you viewers. And a little bit about Norman. He's a licensed professional counselor in Texas, a certified national certified counselor. He also has a certification in traumatic stress studies by Bessel van der Kolk. I love him. His Trauma Research Foundation. He's a PhD candidate in counselor education and supervision at the University of the Cumberlands. And he basically focuses his research and his therapy on near death and other spiritually transformative experiences, as well as special experiences around the end of life, such as terminal lucidity, deathbed visions. Love your whole area of research, Norman. His dissertation will focus on the mental health support needs of near-death experiencers. Other of his interests include complex trauma, grief and life transitions. And again, I'll post where you can find Norman at normanclounig.com. So this is wonderful. So glad for us to be able to get together. And I really want to start out with maybe having each of us speak a little bit to, the fact that we have conventional psychology out there, and it really doesn't acknowledge much, even about spirituality, much less spiritually transformative experiences and spiritual awakenings, right? Our conventional psychology is rather atheist in its stance, in its worldview. And I think each of us have probably had at least one experience, is my guess, that has really profoundly affected our worldview and led us to engage with IANS and maybe, like for me, Spiritual Awakenings International and some other organizations. So why don't we start with you, Norman? Why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the experiences that really impacted your worldview, and then certainly the way you specialize and work with clients.
well, interestingly enough, I consider myself a muggle, somebody who really is on the very low end of any kind of experience, but who has always been curious about spiritually transformative experiences and death and what comes after. When I was really young, perhaps 10, 12 years old, I started reading, discovering at my grandparents' house books by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And I started to get really interested in death and what comes after. And that was an interest that I had lifelong. Sometimes it just popped up stronger. Sometimes I didn't think much about it. And in terms of experiences, the only two things I could really contribute here was that I saw a very awkward terminal lucidity event at my father-in-law's, something that I could elaborate on, but to make it short, essentially, it almost felt like a theater performance in the right moment. There was something legal to be done. The lawyer came in the room. He performed perfectly, and that was after he had been in a state where that theoretically shouldn't have been possible, and he actually died relatively shortly after. So that was remarkable what I saw there. But the other event that I could mention is that coming to counseling for me was literally what I later found out to be a so-called quantum change. I changed from one moment to the other, and it was a change that was, no, not almost, it was physical. It was a change where I walked into a meeting. I had no idea what would come out of it. I was just curious about near-death experiences. I got that encouragement, and finally found out, no, even when you're a little bit later in life, it's not too late to do what your calling is. And before, I had been a person who had been drawn into many different directions, and it was like physically everything just settled down, calmed down in me. And ever since that moment, I knew who I was, no doubts anymore. That was now 9 years ago. It has not changed for a second ever. All that
happened in one meeting.
uncertainty. It was. I came back to my wife after that meeting. She later told me that before I opened my mouth, she could feel that I had changed. So, and since that day, I felt physically different. So quantum change, yes. Terminal lucidity, yes. But despite trying in various ways, I've not had out-of-body experiences or any mediumship type of experiences. So still, I'm on the muggle end of things, but I always had this curiosity about what is going on. There must be more to this world than we can see.
I might have to come back and address that muggle end of things. But first, Kristi, let's hear from you. Clearly, you do psychic readings and you're a medium. Has that been with you since birth? I'd love to hear what have been your most profound experiences.
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I think, part of that, awareness and some of the openings transitioned, throughout my life based on experiences. So, and I'll come back to that piece, but I'll start with where it led to, with knowing, I think from a young age. Well, let me start here. From a young age, I, was easily aware of other people's emotions. So I think, in terms of being able to intuitively pick up other people's emotions, obviously there's the term empath, being able to sense and feel the emotions of others. So that was something that was always with me, from a young age. I can even remember, being in fourth and fifth grade and, classmates really sharing, kind of deep, challenging things with me. So I always kind of knew that I wanted to be a helper. I wanted to help people. And then even early in high school, I knew I wanted to, be a therapist and to be able to counsel people. But a big shift happened for me was when I was 19 years old. And unfortunately, I unexpectedly lost my dad. He was 52 years old, and I lost him to a massive heart attack. And so for me, that there was the awakening there of grief and loss. And that was a big impact on my life in terms of once I, began my therapy career. Grief has always been a specialty area of mine because I knew it, personally and felt the impact of that. But then what I'll say is, actually decades after my father's passing, I began experiencing after death communication from him. And that was something that I didn't have the language of after death communication at the time when those things started. I was aware of signs. I had been working with clients, from a mind, body, spirit perspective and, a transpersonal lens already. But when these things started happening for me, it really shifted everything in a meaningful way. I'll say too, as we've experienced, spiritual awakening can be confusing. It can be, a little destabilizing. And to say that was my experience initially, trying to figure out what am I experiencing. Like I said, I didn't have the language of after death communication, but I was aware of signs and I had read books and, knew about, that concept of being able to receive signs. But then for me, when I began receiving, having telepathic communication, it was mind to mind communication with my dad, and messages and things like that. It really, shifted the way that I viewed how I wanted to work with clients and being able to provide a language for them to where they're having experiences that they may not have wanted to talk about. But when they're normalized and validated, it just, can allow for a lot more conversation and healing. So that was a really big impact for me, was that those after death communications with my dad. Because to go back to your question, at the time, I was aware of mediums, I was aware of mediumship. I had, worked with mentors and guides who were, intuitives, mediums, all of that. But initially, I wasn't aware of my abilities in that way. I wasn't aware that everyday people, or muggle, as Norman says, everyday people can have, communication and connection with their loved ones. But I wasn't aware of that outside of thinking about it in terms of a mediumship session. So I say all that to say is that's what's been a really big, shift for me, is to know that I was having these experiences, but then when they continued and I was able to connect with other family members in spirit, receiving messages from, spirits that I never had contact with in life. So that really, my dad really helped open my awareness of after death communication and my mediumship abilities. And it was something that then I realized it was a heightened ability for me once I recognized what it was. Then that's kind of where things, shifted, and then, personally and career wise.
Well,
So
and that's
Um,
fascinating, isn't it? Because it sounds like in the beginning you did not consider yourself clairvoyant. It was more clairsentient empath. And then maybe kind
yeah.
of claircognizant and kind of like telepathic downloads, if you will.
Right.
Are you clairvoyant now?
Yes, all of them. Yeah. So yeah, I use all the clairs. I mean, my primary, I would say, is actually claircognizant. And so that was the piece when my dad, like we were having the telepathic, I say, communication conversation. It was just a knowing. Like I knew my dad was there. I felt him. I did feel him first. So yeah, it was definitely the clairaudient, the clairsentient feeling, the emotions of others, but also feeling the bodily sensations of the goosebumps or the chills,
Mm.
of things that happen. But now, yes, I use all. I see, hear, feel, and know, anytime when I do readings.
And
and
clairaudient, you were able to hear
Yes,
back then. Norman?
yes.
yes, I just wanted to connect with what you said in the very beginning, Kristi, about being able to sense others' feelings. So that is something actually, when I tune into a person, when I choose to, um, it is difficult to hide emotions from me. So my
Yeah.
wife knows to tell the stories about that. She can tell me how she feels, but I do know how she or my clients feel. So I can tune in on an emotional level. So that is the one thing that I'm experiencing too.
So it sounds like maybe clairsentient is something that's not so muggle. I'm glad we brought this up though about muggle because I would have never considered myself an experiencer in those terms early on. Um, and and yet I would have always considered myself a spiritual experiencer from birth. Like I always felt presence, always felt the interconnectedness. And in the fourth grade, I had my first apport. I guess I'll skip the longer story. I'll just say this was like in the fourth grade, this little cross necklace that I was particularly attached to. And long story short, something I never took off. But in the rare event that an adult talked me into it before a beach, then of course it was lost. But I couldn't stop ruminating about it. And months later, it just appeared on my dresser and nobody knew what I was talking about. I thought maybe the adults found it and somebody put it on my dresser, but nobody knew what I was talking about. So I remember at the time just going, well, thank you, angels, and I had my little cross necklace back. And then in the sixth grade was my first like download because we had learned about atoms that day in school. And so dutifully, I'm there doing my homework on the bed. And this little sixth grader that was always, to me, I just was talking to my invisible people all the time, right? I don't see, so I don't know when it might be Jesus or angels or guides, or I don't know. I just feel it, and I feel the interconnectedness. So there I was, kind of contemplating with the universe, and I remember really intently having the question of like, well, how does that little atom know that it's part of the chair? And then how would that little atom right next to it floating in space know that it's part of me on that chair? And in came this huge download about how everything, even subatomic particles, are alive and conscious in their own way. And of course, I just took the download like, oh, okay, and later on, I realized it's what led me actually into quantum physics. Of course, I wouldn't have known the word physics probably at that time, or the word quantum physics, but I'm sure that gave me that the heading into it, because nobody in my family, there was nobody around that ever was this way or had the worldview that I did, that everything's alive and everything is conscious. And of course, many of us experiencers are called weird or wacko or crazy. And my conventional parents did something similar, except for my very conventional parents who, yes, they went to the Catholic Church every single Sunday. And at the same time, dad was probably cussing out of the parking lot, trying to, fight the traffic. So I didn't consider that it was a particularly religious household. It wasn't really anything talked about at home. But it was kind of fascinating when I would every once in a while hear the story of how here they were back in that hometown now, and I was about 5. And I guess the original Red Lobster was apparently founded in our town of Lakeland, Florida. And they were leaving the Red Lobster and they were moving south along Cleveland Heights Boulevard. And they noticed a UFO pretty visibly. It wasn't like it was far off and you had to guess what it was. And so they were fascinated, of course, and they were headed to a certain person's house to play bridge. And they kind of kept going and they were seeing it. And then next thing you know, they were in the driveway of the home and the UFO was just above tree line and stayed there for such a long period that only my parents would get bored and say, well, should we go in the house and start a bridge game? But in every once in a while, when they never really talked about it, because of course that would be crazy, but it was in the paper the next day, apparently. So apparently it was seen by a lot of people. And I just remember later on in my adult life, if my mother mentioned that story and my friends were close by, they would say, she would go, but where was Valerie? Because we all would have been at the Red Lobster with my dad and Ruby and then heading there and whatever. And where was Val? I can't picture where Val was. And the friends, of course, would look at each other and say, hello, the ship was there for her. What are you talking about? The ship was 4 doors down and just above the pine trees. So it's this contrast of worldviews, right? On one hand, very conventional. And on the other hand, admitting that they saw a UFO, which is completely opposite of conventional, but in every other respect being conventional, and every thought out of my head was apparently kind of odd, weird, and, different. And at the same time, what was kind of, fascinating about all of that is I never considered myself experiencer because, like Kristi, you developed your mediumship skills later. But for me, I just thought psychic meant, because I was kind of raised in very conservative types of environments. And I was raised that psychic meant you were clairvoyant and you saw dead people. And that wasn't me. So I'm more like, Norman said, muggle, like I'm not an experiencer. And yet, I'll be talking at this on June 7th a little bit more when I speak at the Spiritual Awakenings International conference coming up. But what's interesting is when I came out of the caregiving stint that I just did, and Spirit was kind of telling me to get out and get people talking about their spiritual experiences more, I really did a deep dive into the literature and what can all of us clinicians learn as far as what is the prevalence of the types. I wanted prevalence and I wanted breadth, right? I didn't want just the 5 clairs. I wanted like, what are the array of experiences and what are the prevalence rates? And I really couldn't find what I was looking for. And I remember going to Elane Wabe over at IANS and talking about her Noetic Signature Inventory that had just come out. And that definitely reveals to us that we each have a personal style, right? So Norman's more clairsentient, I'm more clairsentient. You have all your clairs developed now. But clearly Norman and I aren't clairvoyant and in that way. And but you know, there is Elane kind of studying the style that we perceive and the style that we express. And after talking to her, I realized that I couldn't use that with clients. So I actually developed my own, and it's about 10 pages. It's a long assessment, but I was trying to decide what was going to be done with it. And synchronistically, that within the next month or so, I was attending a Neuroscience Needs a Revolution to Understand Consciousness symposium put on by University of Arizona and the Science of Consciousness. And next thing you know, Sean Esbjorn Harjan is up there and he's announcing how they're at California Institute of Human Sciences. They're creating a new program and he's going to do a super experiencer project. So that really perked up my ears. And next thing you know, I was contacting him and he said, yeah, I would love if you would share your assessment with us. And I did. And at the same time, there is a survey people can take out, and they've kind of decided to go in a different direction of a certain number of categories. And they're still trying to say how many of us are spiritual, like super experiencers. But to Norman's point, I still, right now, somebody said, are you a super experiencer? I'd be like, what? Like maybe Kristi, but not me. But you know what's funny? And Norman, I wonder if this will happen to you too, if you end up looking at this website. But of all the categories, I've had experiences in all of them except for 2. And then when I look at the Noetic Signature Inventory, I've had either experiences receiving or expressing in every single one of the 10 of the 12. So all but 2. And so then by that definition, I guess I'm a super experiencer. And yet that doesn't even make sense. So I don't know. What are your thoughts about that, either of you?
Well, I was going to just add, I think both of you bring up really good points in regards to when we think about like we talk about Muggle, like Norman mentioned, and you, Valerie, it's like I think it's important to talk about how I think we would all agree everyone is intuitive. We're born with intuition and to varying degrees. And I think there's things that we all experience. Each of us are talking about we've experienced things from a certain age. And I think, it can be again, and it's not about categorizing this or that or better or worse or whatever. I mean, again, I think it's a matter of recognizing that we view things through our own lens because yes, some of my mediumship abilities, they were always with me. I wasn't aware of it, but we're talking about these experiences we had where Norman's like, oh, I've always kind of been able to easily pick up the feelings of people or to know what they were feeling or feel them ourselves. So I think it's we look at things through a lens and without having extra information or education about it, lots of people are having experiences of all different things and they may think, oh, well, this is just how I am. Well, isn't everybody like this? Because I even, had the same experiences, just to share this in terms of even when I was doing therapy and I would staff with one of my colleagues and I was like, well, don't you just get XYZ? And she's like, no, so I just say that to say we have, different experiences that can be part of the list and all of the things you're talking about. So, not to ramble on, but I think everybody probably fits into that. They just don't know it because they may think, well, doesn't everybody experience the same thing, or they don't know how to classify it or to have some information about it.
Yes, thank you.
I think,
Norman.
yeah, I think it has also to do with certain expectations. For example, I always would have liked to get some after-death communication from my deceased parents. Nothing. It's not like I didn't meditate, sit there, open myself up. It wasn't that I wasn't looking, but somehow nothing came through. So didn't work. I've been to workshops like at the Monroe Institute, and people experience things to different levels. And I experienced that I had like a small black and white TV, and I did have actually one interesting experience there, even though it was just very small black and white, while others had like a 3D IMAX color screen. They could experience things while doing a walking meditation. That was, um, yeah. If this fits, I'll share that small black and white
Yes,
TV
absolutely.
experience. We had this one, and it was the Monroe Institute Gateway experience. And one, I had asked the person who was part of the group and who had some intuitive psychic abilities. I had asked her, "What can you help me identify what my block is?" Well, but she said no, she wasn't going to do that and everything. So I respected that. Boundaries, well, it was all okay. After one specific exercise, and we were supposed to report what we had experienced, I said, well, I didn't really experience much, but towards at the very end of the exercise, it felt like in the upper right-hand corner, there was something that I perceived to be as that person actually, and as if, and like a little, like, these dual lens Rolleiflex cameras, like an old-fashioned one. So it was just a perception that wasn't really in my eye, but more off to the side, very small, black and white, just a sense of that person with a Rolleiflex camera. She turns around and she says, actually, towards the end of our session, I was actually scanning your body to figure out if I could find your blockage. So I detected that this person was scanning me. And
Nice.
that was, it was
Wow.
it was a very small experience, and it was, as I said, the small black and white TV, but I can't say it was nothing. It was just smaller than, and other people seem to have an easier time. They seem to have better receptors, but there might be a level to which either everyone or most of us are indeed, if we allow ourselves and are in the right state of mind and in the right situation, to receive something.
Well, I agree with Kristi on that, that I think we all have that as potential. However, like I said, maybe not in every category of type or style, but we certainly have something potential. And clearly for you, it was more clairsentient. And I know in my experience, and I'd love to hear about you guys, whether personally or with clients, for me, it is very, very clear. When I am in left brain or my clients are in left brain, these things more diminish, if you will. And at the same time, when you're personally trying to let go of the left brain, so to speak, and just allow that more creative openness be there, then that's when it's there. Like even when I was getting ready to write that book, it was all about spiritual experiences and helping clients and what have you. And that is similar to when the three of us are in front of our clients, right? Like I'm sure every single one of us, when we're in front of our clients, is probably when we feel so psychic because the information, is just going to keep coming for them because we're attuned. It's like the channel is open. We're wanting to help them and it can come so easily. And then I'm writing the book. And again, that intention is there and it's about waiting for information to come in. And so I know for me, I like the way Norman, how you said that little in the upper right hand corner. I know for me, it always feels like the information is coming over my right shoulder. And again, there's nothing, it's not that I haven't had some visual stuff, I have, but I don't normally put it in the clairvoyant category, maybe wrongly. But it's like I'll feel, it's like it still feels clairsentient because it feels like the weight of something, and it feels telepathic because then I know what is being tried to say, and I might get it, if this makes sense, an image that's not really a visible image. Like I know what the image is, but it's not like I'm seeing the image.
I think that was a perfect description of how I
Was it?
perceived that image in the upper right-hand corner, because it was like an image, but I don't really see it as clear. So you just described that very well.
And
Well,
let
I
me
and
knew
just
what it
jump in.
was.
too.
I was going to say just real quick and let me jump in to tell you both that actually can be considered clairvoyant. So it's when you see images, even if they flash in your mind's eye, that can, I mean, again, however we label it, but yes, that can be clairvoyant to where you're having these images pop in. So it can be, it's like it's in your mind's eye, similar to like, someone can be clairaudient and hear a sound or a voice. It doesn't have to be a loud booming voice or the actual voice. It can be an inner, like it's an inner hearing, kind of like the same thing you both are describing with the images. So y'all both had those experiences.
Well, and it is helpful when we all start talking about it because it's helpful to kind of realize how we have differences. Norman, you were going to
Yeah.
say something.
Yeah, I was also going to say, about the connection with our clients and getting into the space. Um, because in order to pick up things from clients, something that I like to do very often, I don't always do that, but I've done it frequently with clients, especially when they are not in the right space of mind. They come stressed from work, and I'll take 3 deep breaths, like very slowly, like in, and then a very long exhale through the mouth with them. And then 2 people do that at the same time in the same rhythm. Then they ground themselves and they sync up on a level that is deeper. And that way you open them up to you and you open yourself up to them. So it might be something to help bring these abilities into the session, open the client's mind and soul up to receiving.
And I love that you shared that. And thanks for sharing that specifically with viewers who, especially if they're fellow therapists who might be wondering, how do you connect, right? How do you more intentionally connect? So thank you for sharing that. And at the same time, a lot of us may be aware of Heartmath and their work, and how to sink in the heart and the brain and get into heart coherence and what have you. And at the same time, a clairsentient, or someone who feels like they're picking up quantum information, if you will, because we're doing it non-locally, it's at a distance. um, like you said, if the person is open naturally, like if they're not thinking about it, but they know they're open, and we like are allowed to touch into their field, if you will, it does seem like we will be connected and we will get that information. On the other hand, a beginner therapist who might be in their left brain, not feeling their open confidence, they might be rehearsing, what am I supposed to do, and how am I supposed to listen, and how am I supposed to reflect to my client? And, if you're all in that mental space, that's when we actually are our least helpful self, right? Because we're more in that left brain, and it seems to change the channel of the intuition. Let me touch in a direction unexpected, but just a real quick tangent. It's interesting because when I've looked in the literature, most of our field doesn't even seem to believe in intuition. And they basically, when I'll go look at the research studies, it almost seems like they keep operationally defining intuition in the same way most people would operationally define instinct. And I know for me how I very much have a distinct definition for each of those. But would either of you like to speak to that?
Well, on the intuition, I'm not sure it's really that bad in the field, because I see more and more people doing somatic work. And whenever you gain awareness of your body, of how whatever happens in your mind shows up in your body, you're talking about intuition, how your body senses what is going on. So I'm very optimistic that more people are starting to integrate somatic work. But you're definitely right. There are probably people who have been CBT only, very mind structure, organization focused people who didn't consider that. But for me, believing is not the right word. Do I believe in the sky? It's there. Can we interpret the sky differently or think about it differently? Like, what can we do with the sky? What does the sky mean to us? Yes, but it's there. And I believe, well, I don't believe, I know intuition is there as well. The question is, do we do something with it? Do we see it as an unimportant part of our personality, as something that we can discard? And you're very right. I think there are probably still too many therapists who are discarding a very valuable piece.
Right. Kristi, any thoughts about it?
Yeah, well, a couple things. I definitely would agree that I feel more positive about, in terms of the field, there being more holistic approaches, kind of like what Norman's saying with somatic work, encompassing mind, body, spirit. Sure, there's the evidence-based, theoretical approaches that most therapists do use, CBT, DBT. There's a variety of things. But I do think there are many that are also leaning in towards of looking at the mind body connection, and then how intuition ties in with that. And I think again it's left brain, right brain. I think that there's more awareness, and I think awareness of the part that intuition plays, but I think maybe to to not to what extent, but then the comfort level depending on where that goes along the continuum. And just to go back to intuition and instinct, yeah, I think that, when we look at things in terms of, our autonomic nervous system and we think of fight or flight and the active, busyness of our brain, and then in terms of, the sympathetic nervous system where we can relax, rest, digest, there's awareness about, that. And I think that's also a matter of when we're not in our active thinking brain, that's where intuition can come in and we can feel things, know things, think about someone, and then call them and they say, oh, they were about to call us or text us. So I wanted to say that piece. But also in terms of intuition and instinct, I think instinct ties more into it can kind of safety, survival. Not that intuition can't help us with that as well, but that's where I do, I see a subtle difference in between those. And like instinct is more, there's similarities, but instinct can be survival or go here, don't go here, this doesn't feel safe. Whereas intuition can be for safety, but I feel like it can be very beneficial, for us on a daily basis with anything, decision making. It's not only, I would say maybe, instinct, we think of survival mode, if that makes sense.
Well, it does. And thank you both for that because, I'm sure that we and then viewer therapists are probably going to be asked at certain points in times, how do I differentiate between the instinct and the intuition? And I know for me, the way I've started describing the difference is autopilot is a thing, right? Instinct, autopilot is a thing. It is our neuroplastic normal. And my clients know we probably can't go a day without hearing the word neuroplasticity. So to me, it's a marvel when we just realize how much that our whole nervous system is this very active, dynamic system, and it's probably changing with every thought we think, right? I mean, if we start talking about a really sour lemon, people usually start salivating very quickly. And so, if anybody wanted to know if there's a mind body connection, to me, all you have to do is that to prove it to yourself that there
Right.
is. And
Exactly.
so, imagine that every thought we're thinking is being reacted to by the nervous system. And anything we do repeatedly, we get hardwired for. And so, that is our instinct. That is our new normal. And luckily, from our DNA in genetic coding, we do come in with some autopilot instructions. And thank goodness, because I wouldn't want to order a computer that didn't have any kind of operating station, operating system to it. And at the same time, if we want to install a new program, we can, right? We can override something, we can update something, and our body seems to be equipped with that exact same thing. Intuition, on the other hand, for me, the way I've differentiated it is we can tell this isn't us. It is information coming through some avenue, and we know it wasn't our thought. It is external. But it is interesting, like you said, it's I'm optimistic too. I'm overjoyed when I think of, compared to my 20s and 30s and 40s, and now I'm in my 60s. I mean, I am so overjoyed to know that, right, we have, like, right off the top of my head, I can think of 10 cutting edge organizations that are out there studying consciousness and are willing to not only go mind body science and somatic, I love the somatic work, but really go into studying spiritually transformative experiences, transpersonal experiences, and therefore just studying the clairs, and studying how is it that we can increase these innate abilities. And I do think that it seems to be a consensus that when we practice, it's just like any other muscle, right? Just because it's not a physical muscle doesn't mean it doesn't get rooted physically. And as we practice clairsentience, or whatever we're doing with clients, or clairvoyance, or what have you, the muscle increases. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I would like to just go back for a second to what Kristi said. First of all, I love that distinction between instinct and intuition. It really brings it to the point. And Valerie, what you said about the programs, I think that is the danger, that sometimes we install programs or work so much on that mind level up to the point where they override or suppress the intuition. And I think that's where we need to be careful and not hard code these programs too much, but leave some room for the intuition. And because Kristi mentioned DBT, well, DBT uses some mindfulness. Many approaches nowadays use mindfulness. So people, I think, are generally afraid to openly speak about going outside the purely mental framework because of insurance requirements, because of the just general medical model that we counselors in one way say we are going beyond, but then at the same time, you have to follow the same rules, be in the same box. So people don't like to talk about it. But as soon as you introduce mindfulness in therapy, you're starting to open up these channels for intuition. And I think more and more people are doing that, but are afraid to talk about it.
Well, I so agree. And that actually leads us right nicely into another question. And that is, as you guys reflect on your personal experiences, your experiences with clients, and what we've been talking about here, right? Like really heading into a profession, right? That starts acknowledging spiritually transformative experiences, transpersonal experiences as legitimate, not hallucination type experiences. And certainly all of us are in that mind frame, and we specialize in that regard. And at the same time, you guys are practicing psychotherapy on a daily basis. I'm starting to do more experience or coaching rather than psychotherapy. And at the same time, right, there are those challenges from an insurance standpoint, and just in general, right? Evidence-based practice. So I would just love to hear from each of you, like when you're thinking of the conventional psychotherapy framework and expectations, ethical guidelines, and what have you, insurance guidelines, what is considered treatment for a specific diagnosis. How do you navigate this landscape, right? And yeah, because there's going to be challenges, there's going to be ethical things for us to navigate. And I would just love to hear from you how you're doing that. Anybody want to go first?
I'll go ahead and jump in.
Okay.
I was saying I can jump in just because I mean, in terms of insurance and billing and all of that, I used to handle that directly for my practice, so I have a lot of experience and I've trained, staff on all that. So, I'll jump in and, I think for all of us, and for me personally too, I mean, obviously for Norman to speak for Norman, but, ethics is, extremely important in every aspect of what we do in terms of, therapy and how we're working with our clients and how we're navigating insurance if we're, utilizing insurance or if we're insurance based. So with that being said, I think it's a matter of, really looking at, what are they coming in, what is, the client coming in for? What are they looking to, see be better, see be different in their life? What are they struggling with? And oftentimes, how I want to go into this. So oftentimes, I mean, there can be many things going on at once, and so it's assessing for that. As y'all know, we use the DSM in terms of assessing criteria, symptoms, and things of that nature. But and I won't go into this in a lot of detail because I don't want to misquote, but even I think through Spiritual Awakenings International, I believe it was last year, there was a medical doctor that came on and spoke how he and others were really instrumental in getting a criteria added to the DSM, which is a V code or a Z code. So other, what that means is, other, it's not necessarily labeled as a disorder, but there's room for addressing spiritual concerns or spiritual issues. So with that being said, there's, definitely a piece, to be able, not a piece, but there's a way to be able to work with clients with whatever they're coming in for to address if they're going through a spiritual awakening or they're having these spiritual experiences. And it still be, we're following ethics, we're following, insurance guidelines and diagnosing and all of that, but really to be able to help them with what they're coming in for in a way that there may not be insurance, you know, red tape or issues with that. So those are just some of the things, that I would, say in regards to that has gotten much better. And we have a way to work with individuals to say, hey, these are experiences that people do have. They can be a focus of therapy. They're going to be covered and we can work with them on that.
Thank you,
So,
Kristi.
Sure.
and really working with a client, person-centered, and that is the basis for most of us. It's not all we do, but it's the basis. Also means listening to them, validating them, seeing them as a person. And this open validation is absolutely within the framework of what we are called to do. And we're also called to work from the client's framework. So if the client has a framework that aligns with our framework, great. But if not, we're still called to work within their framework. Now, as part of their challenges, they usually experience something like whatever anxiety or depression, or they have certain symptoms. And that is what we can put down. And in our conversation with them, we can provide the space for them to um, express their experiences openly, also in terms of spiritual experiences. For example, a person coming to you for grief, but they say, well, I keep finding pennies everywhere all of a sudden. Well, be open-minded. Even if you don't believe in anything, you can ask, well, what does that mean for you? You can still work with the client's framework. And if we're doing that, and if we take these clearly diagnosable symptoms that are there, our documentation will focus on that because we're still working on relieving these symptoms and still working on how improving their lives. And part of the conversation will be that we're open to including all their experiences in that treatment. So I think it is ethical up to a point where I just sometimes wonder, is it ethical not to include the spiritual dimension? Because all of us
Absolutely.
have that. How can you ignore that? It feels to me like ignoring that dimension is just as unethical as not asking, what do you eat? How do you sleep? Are you taking drugs? because we need to understand if there's something physical possibly underlying, where we need to refer them to a medical doctor. And we also need to understand if there's anything going on the spiritual level as well.
Well, and I love how you shared that. Like you said, there's the ethics in not addressing things. And that's the sad part when it comes to the insurance, right? Because the insurance only wants to pay for what is medically necessary. And so it is interesting. It sounds like, Norman, if I'm reading you correctly, you're really emphasizing that, we can't put the whole content of a session in a note anyway. And obviously, some trainers want less in there. Some trainers want a little bit more in there, depending on what the organization is when it comes to the note taking. But at the very least, if we're treating depression or grief or whatever it is, we certainly can focus on what is helping, and is it going up, is it going down? We certainly can do that. And it just might be that a lot of other, what is going on with the client, some of the detail, obviously not everything is going to make the notes. And Kristi, it'd be interesting, with the level of training you had on that, as far as how often organizations might get monitored, for especially by the insurance companies, looking at actual notes and stuff. Do you know of anything that might get declined because we happen to mention doing this for spiritual purposes as opposed to strictly medical?
No, and I think that's a great question. And I just want to add, I'll answer that, but I just wanted to validate what Norman said and agree with. Yes, I mean, we definitely look at, I think, just as important as the insurance billing, diagnosing, and all that from an ethical standpoint, is that we're working with the whole person, and we're working with all of their experiences and how we can ethically do that and navigate within sometimes insurance constraints and things like that. So I wanted to mention that, but that ties in, Valerie, to your question about, I think, and again, with, I've had my private practice for 13 years now, and I think well, not I think, I know, because I also worked at a community mental health facility many years ago at the beginning of my career. And I think what it ties into, some of it is it ties into which insurances you're in network with, meaning they vary in terms of the degree of, maybe the length of notes and things like that. But from again, an ethical standpoint, we're always providing, evidence-based care, ethically, based care, trauma-informed, spiritually informed, whatever the case is, culturally sensitive to what our clients are coming in for. So with that being said, there are some insurance companies that are going to want much more detailed notes. But again, in my experience, community mental health, with certain insurances, they would want much more information. There could be things that were declined. Being now in private practice, there's sometimes less constraints on that. We still do everything we're supposed to do. But in terms of the clients I've worked with that are coming in for a variety of reasons, including spiritual concerns, or not even necessarily concerns, but trying to make sense of or meaning of it and needing help navigating it. I personally, through my practice, we've never run into anything being, declined, in that nature. And I think some of the diagnosing capabilities of, being able to say this may be a concern they're coming in with spiritually, a spiritual concern, there's a way to capture that and to navigate that. So I haven't run into that to where it's something that's being declined because that's something that's being focused on in therapy, in addition to maybe other concerns or issues that they're having.
Yes, thank you both for that. I think there's, a lot of therapists out there that might kind of have these concerns and questions. And this kind of brings me, and Norman, you had said that, we have ethics to, you know, like to ignore certain things is an ethical problem also. And I don't know about you guys, but I have a number of experiencer clients who have basically detailed to me the harm that they have had from conventional psychotherapy. And most of the time it's called, I have secondary trauma now, because I had this or this situation, or like I'm thinking of one client who was in a car accident and she was already an experiencer, but she had a car accident, and it also, she literally had to get an operation on her brain and a couple of other things. But on the other side of that, she's recovering, and she's still an experiencer. She was before, she was after, but then it sounded like the profession was just really trying to lump everything into, you have brain damage and you're hallucinating things and you have these delusional beliefs and what have you, and then it caused a huge secondary trauma. So I'd love to hear from you guys about that. Whoever wants to go first.
I'll go ahead. I would just want to say first and foremost, I'm definitely sorry to hear that you know so many people who that's been their experience, and that's unfortunate. And where I'll say, I'm very thankful for there being so many organizations out there that are trying to educate not only experiencers but also mental health professionals, medical professionals. As far as Spiritual Awakenings International, obviously IONS. There's so many. And I think that's really important. There's conferences, all of that. With that being said, absolutely there are people who are experiencing that, and the invalidation and the lack of understanding. Thankfully, there's many of us that are therapists who do understand these experiences, have sought out training, whether we've had our own experiences or not. Many of us have. But just as when we're working with clients with anything, we're not going to always have experienced everything that they've experienced, but it's important to remain knowledgeable and do research or consult or refer out if it's something that is out of our scope of practice. And I'll just add briefly, yes, it's unfortunate that people are having secondary trauma and really harmful experiences with therapists who aren't educated, trained, do the research around these type of experiences, because I've personally experienced it myself in a clinical setting. In terms of when I, was initially sharing some of my own experiences when I was first making sense of them. So it's unfortunate that therapists are in a position to cause harm, and which is why I'm so passionate about educating not only clients about how to navigate these situations and be an open and safe space for the exploration and the meaning making and the integration of it. But it's just really not that it didn't before, but lit a fire to really be educating mental health professionals, because I've experienced harm myself from one.
Thank you for sharing that. What are your thoughts, Norman?
Yeah, I think first of all, I have heard these stories at IONS as well, from many people. They're very common. Um, Jan Holden, former president of IONS, who was also a researcher, in 2014 wrote an article with some co-authors on the subject. So the lack of initial validation understanding is a problem. It is also especially a problem when children have these experiences and they're not properly acknowledged. As an associate, I worked in a correctional facility part-time, doing some classes and some individual counseling. And I met a person who was extremely spiritually gifted. However, since he, as a child, had seen the spirit of his dead grandmother, and he grew up in a very religious household, he was immediately drugged up, like literally sent to the doctor, given drugs to suppress all of that. Now, that suppression continued on over the years. Still in that correctional facility, I don't remember if he was in his late 40s or even in his 50s, he was still predominantly on drugs. Now, during times that he wasn't on these psychiatric drugs, he was actually extremely intuitive. He was actually a natural medium and very sensitive person. But his whole life was derailed because of that, because there were these prescription drugs. Later on, he didn't know what to do with these things. So alcohol came, some other drugs came, partially, I guess, because of the social environment, but partially because of this struggle that he had, he ended up going downhill his whole life. And that same person, if he would have been validated from childhood on and would have been treasured for the gifts he had, and I had the pleasure actually of meeting him once or twice when he wasn't on the drugs. What an intuitive person, but he could have, his whole life would have been different. I would have never met him in a correctional facility. And interestingly, in that facility, I understand that the psychiatrist there, the main one, also put him on drugs. But then he talked to another psychiatrist one day who met him, and she had a background of Islamic faith. And she told him, this is actually what you're experiencing is actually spiritual. You shouldn't be on drugs for that. But the system, the traditional system, they'll drug up people. So not validating experiences can do physical and long-term harm. And even just not acknowledging them, if somebody carries with them all their lives certain doubts and questions that always go unresolved, that can lead to anxiety later on. It can lead to other symptoms. And now we're back at the insurance side of things, because then they'll come to us to help relieve these symptoms. But of course, when we can help people understand more about this and help prevent everybody, but then also especially young children, to be dismissed for these spiritual experiences, then I think we can do a lot of good by this prevention.
I think that is an invaluable example of how the harm can change the trajectory of a life. I think of how the invalidation changed the trajectory of my life. I did not become a therapist until 40. And it was really because the universe just was not going to leave me alone until I changed. And I say very irreverently, I was in a hell no, I won't go position, because and so the universe had to work pretty hard on me, because it was Skinnerism, it was Freudian, and the kind of thing back then that would have been in the 70s or early 80s. I mean, there was nothing to a spiritual experiencer that was going to sound safe getting into that environment. I can just think of so many lives that have been derailed, and I can think of some of the most simple I don't even really want to call them treatments, but the most simple things we can do with clients that will completely take that off. And maybe I will go there just a second before coming back. Make sure I ask you about psychedelics next. I'm thinking of, for example, there was a client that she was in high school, but I think she was supposed to be a senior. She only had the credits, let's say, for being a sophomore. And she was in a huge depression, apparently, according to her mother. And her mother, of course, is bringing her to therapy to go get fixed. And I could tell that the biggest problem was this being behind, and it was creating a spiral. And when she finally probably saw enough books on my shelf that felt safe to say what was really going on, as it turns out, she saw shadow people. But because she saw shadow people, she worried, like, am I crazy, right? And she didn't feel safe revealing anything, but that thought was kind of spiraling her a little bit. It was making her get depressed, and then it was making her grades suffer, and that's how she got behind. So within a few sessions, clearly she felt safe enough to tell me about this. I can't even tell you how quickly therapy went from there. This was when I was in my private practice, so I was still practicing, under traditional psychotherapy. But I walked over to my office. I walked over to my shelf and took a book from MIT physicist Claude Swanson, Science of the Paranormal, off of the shelf, showed her the paranormal figure on the front. And I said, well, this MIT physicist completely believes you. The whole issue went away. I basically talked to the mom and convinced the mom to let her just go get her GED at the community college so that she could just go over to the community college and start fresh, new peers, new whatever, like done deal. Like it was amazing. And I think of, I too, right, had my part in community mental health, and then had the part where I was working with my juvenile justice and child welfare kids and gangster kids and what have you. But I remember this one gal in particular who was really, really, really grieving and stressing about the fact that she had had an abortion early on. Of course, I'm talking to her. She's probably only 16 as it was. And it was interesting because she felt safe enough to bring that up for me. And next thing I know, I'm giving her a book by John Edwards, who at the time was the, publicly discussed medium who seemed to have a lot of credibility. I think Gary Shorts, by the way, ended up studying him and said, yeah, he's the real deal. But anyway, so I gave her that book, and I'm like, look, there are people who completely believe you, because she I'm combining a couple stories there. We were at a Fort Allen Naval Base, not Fort Allen, Fort Logan Naval Base. And essentially what the girls didn't know, or the guys, is, they come and go. But those of us who stay as they come and go would hear about the same reports of the same ghosts in the same rooms, over and over, right? So there would be these ghosts of soldiers that would be reported. So I remember when, on one hand, she was talking about seeing the ghosts in a room. And so we have this conversation about John Edwards, and it all dovetailed into the conversations about grief over her abortion, because we started talking about spirits and what do we believe about after death and after death communications and what have you. So after these conversations, she was so excited one day. She came up to me and she literally was talking about like Norman's quantum leap. She was in a completely different state. She was completely elated. And she said, oh, the baby essentially that she had aborted had come to her in the night and communicated with her in her sleep. And it was like, no worries, Mom. I just really wanted a tiny, tiny little bit of experience of life. And that was all contracted. That was all the way it was supposed to be. And I'll come back to you later. Like her whole heart was completely changed, right? It was a situation. So like you said, when we don't really deal with what actually is going on because we're afraid to deal with these topics, it can make therapy last a really long time when it doesn't have to. So let me switch over to talking about psychedelics, because as you guys kept talking about it, it was bringing this up because you and I know it's in the news constantly. I can't get on any of our sites anymore without everybody talking about the psychedelic research, psychedelic programs, psychedelic retreats, psychedelic this, that, and the other. And personally, I have mixed feelings about it, because on one hand, if there is such a person that is so depressed that the only alternative is electroshock therapy, well, I much rather them, have a psychedelic experience than have to, do electroshock therapy or something. But at the same time, I'm a little dismayed because our whole society is based on meds and drugs, and everything's a physical substance, and people aren't aware of these innate gifts because they're so hinged in their worldview to the physical and to the material, and that we need everything material and physical to have any effects, right? It's part of the whole worldview of space-time the way we have it now. So with psychedelics, to me, there's that very significant and real risk that the person might have an experience with the psychedelic, but they will believe that they need the psychedelic. And then it to keep having this experience with the world. And then to me, that's not that far off from alcoholism and other drug abuse. So I would just love to hear from you guys what your thoughts are about this emphasis that's out there now. Norman?
Yeah, I have to say I disagree with you.
Good.
And
Okay.
one of the reasons is really because There was a misunderstanding, which I hoped had been resolved over time now, where people thought psychedelics cause something. But really, they open something up, they remove a block. So they're not doing anything to you other than helping you remove a block. Now, for some people might need to just take a little bit and remove that block and open up. And luckily, they're non-addictive. And people who are sometimes opened up with psychedelics can later on then better get back into these states without the psychedelics. So there's no dependency, but an opening up. And um, I, um, I've been myself, I've been getting ketamine infusions and have experienced that and compared that to others. Once again, I just had like a little small experience because I might have a block inside me, while others on lesser doses have large experiences. But it's not about the drug causing the experience, but the drug opening up something in you. So personally, I think if people don't have the time to go into deep meditation for 20 years and eventually arrive there, but if they need like a little bit of a quicker boost to opening something up to realize there is this other dimension and opening up to their feelings, I think that is very, very useful and not as a long-term thing. Actually, I think for the pharma industry, this is a bad deal because you don't need to give them months over months over months the same drugs. Many people just might just need one session, others a few, but it's important that this happens under guidance. The psychotherapy needs to be a critical part of that. The drug does only help to open up the work that then begins from there. So companies sending around these drugs like candy, well, that's not the idea, right? So there are proper ways of using psychedelics, and there are some ways that have at least questionable ethics, where it could work, but it could also be abused. And there has been some abuse. We know, I forgot the name of the actor who died, who abused it. But generally, psychedelics do not themselves lead to addiction. So used in the proper psychotherapeutic context, I see a lot of promise with them as catalysts, not to replace the true experiences. But and if we can reach the same, if we can do the same without the psychedelics, great. But I believe there is a place, not for every client, not in every situation, but I think there is a place for them based on my experience.
Well, and thank you for that. And do you believe, do we have any, is there any kind of ethical direction that says we should at least help them try meditative means? And I don't mean the ones that take 20 years, but like there's so many things I've been able to get clients to have experiences in 1 or 2 sessions just naturally even. And so I'm wondering, should we even try there, or is it okay to just go right to the psychedelic?
It depends on the client, right? If somebody might be in such a deep depression that there's just no way that you can get them to say, well, I go to this breathwork workshop over this weekend first, and then you'll relax. It's just not happening.
Yes.
Now, if there is a client for whom that is an option and they can reach similar states through breathwork and meditation and other things, then we probably shouldn't pull out the big guns initially. And it's important that therapists are trained. And just because I had some experiences myself and I've read some, I've studied some training material, I still would wait until I had like a proper, longer certification type class, and they take sometimes a year. So to before I would integrate that into my therapy practice. So we should do that in a trained and ethical way, and it will depend on the client if we go there straight or if we use other methods first, which is preferable if that is a realistic option for that client, but it's not for everybody.
Yeah, well said. What are your thoughts, Kristi?
Yeah, I mean, would agree with Norman. I think there's many layers to that. I think but it does start with balance. And, what I would say is that there's a lot of, legislation now in terms of certain medications that are being approved, certain psychedelics that are being approved for the treatment of PTSD, trauma, things of that nature that are showing, again, I don't know all the specifics, but I've read enough that, there's legislature being passed in terms of there being, these psychedelics and alternative treatments approved because, and in certain situations, one, because of how effective they are, but there are also individuals who may have been in, years of therapy or may be experiencing, kind of drug resistant depression, trauma, PTSD, things of that nature. So those are other avenues that can be very, beneficial for them. But I think, like Norma was saying, it's all going to depend on, what it depends on the person, and what's, truly needed, as well. And to speak to the addiction piece, like he said, I would agree with that. I think that, again, it's about balance, and there's going to be specific regimens that individuals are prescribed in terms of ketamine treatment and things like that. I can speak to, I did have a client who she was struggled with depression resistance to the medication she had been on, many different ones years prior. And so she was actually, before starting to come to see me, she was having ketamine treatment outside, and she had therapists that were helping with all of that. And to speak to what Norman said, I think what we're talking about in terms of ethically and, not doing harm, that's something that I, again, would encourage. Therapists need to be trained, like he said, to have the experience of, working with those individuals and what type of experiences they may have after having, ketamine treatments or whatever type of psychedelics they may be using to help them navigate, to navigate all of that. But I definitely think there's a lot more talk about it because of how effective it can be for many people for different reasons. But I think it still goes back to, doing it in a way that's, safe, ethical, knowing how to best support the individuals as they're, receiving those type of treatments, because they are showing that they're very, they're very effective. And there's, like I said, a lot of universities and places that are doing the research, to show this. So anything I think that, is going to be something that can benefit someone, is definitely worth, exploring and looking at. The last thing I'll just say, where you mentioned, yes, about the actor, I think that, for anyone that has a predisposition to, addiction and things like that, those can be more things to be aware of, and the concern, just like even if it's a prescription medication, a pain medication, somebody may need a surgery. And if they have a history of, or in their family history of, alcoholism, addiction, those are things to be aware of. Doesn't mean that by having it prescribed or using a certain type of treatment that they're automatically going to become addicted to it. No, I don't think so. But I think it's important to be aware of, the history and potential for certain individuals.
Yeah, and I really love all the points that you guys brought up. So thanks for that. Let me let me switch to worldview, right? Because conventional psychotherapy is really grounded in space-time rules, classical physics. This is all there is. Even though I might add, I remember when in science class, I don't know, was at the sixth grade also, but I remember when I was first learning about the electromagnetic field, and the fact that the visible portion was just that tiny, 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 tiny sliver. And I remember thinking, is there something lost here? Because this just goes to prove right there that there's more that we can't see than more than we can see. So why is it that science is so seeming to be insistent that the only thing that is real is what we can see physically? And Western mental health is, the part that's causing harm is kind of grounded in that kind of classical physics, where we kind of believe that the only thing is what you can see and what you can really, hear electromagnetically and what have you. So I would just love to hear from you guys, like, how have transpersonal experiences affected your worldview? And how do you navigate this classical, let's say, in my case, I had to go to quantum physics. Like every bone in my body led me to be obsessed with studying quantum physics because it was the only way I could find the scientific validation I was looking for. Not that we completely have it, that, I don't want viewers to think that I'm saying that quantum physics proves transpersonal experiences. Obviously, in scientific language, we can't say that in that way. But at the same time, when you're looking at the scientific paradigms out there, there are many things happening in quantum physics that have certain vocabularies that are so useful for experiencers, because when you hear what the words are, like, for example, if you are hearing things about entanglement, if you're hearing things about non-locality, the fact that things aren't just having a local effect, right? That any effect has to be really close by and through a physical medium, and that's how you have a cause and effect. That's classical science. And yet non-locality has been shown since the early 1900s, and entanglement, which is a feature of non-locality, where, let's say, you can have entangled particles that you can put one across the cosmos from the other, and as soon as you interact with one, the other is immediately affected. And this has been proven in quantum science over and over and over again. So the concept of a non-local consciousness is something that, to me, we have to go to in order to get to the point where we have science validating spiritual experiences, if you will, because there, to me, when we start looking at psi research, it's all little non-local consciousness that we're actually talking about. And yet that's not where the field of psychology is. So I don't know, any thoughts of anything you guys want to share about how worldview is influencing us, and where does our field of psychology have to go? Norman?
Yeah, first of all, my worldview wasn't really dependent on my experiences because I always believed there was more. However, the you already talked about quantum physics. The problem is that the materialists are, and I'm calling the classical Newtonian physics just materialists.
Yes.
They're ignoring that we have knowledge now that actually puts them in their place. When I say puts them in their place, I mean, yes, they do have their place, and there is more to it.
Yes.
And in that sense, you've heard the term probably paradigm shift, and the paradigm shift in science just takes way too long. I do believe there's a lot of promise, and my personal hope is that quantum physics, quantum mechanics will help to explain some of the phenomena that we know exist, and give us good explanatory models for that. And I think we urgently need that, and it will help us to open up and broaden the field of psychology. And on a philosophical level, I personally like Wilber's integral theory, because he has really described in one model how this world works, so to speak, up into the spiritual levels. And I think it's a very plausible model. But I think there's one question that we can never, ever answer. And that is the question, why? Because even if we know there is God or God force or universal power, and that is the origin, we still don't know why. So I have resorted to accepting that we are here in this experience, in this adventure, um, and have an opportunity to learn everything about life and love and make the best out of that. Out of that, and there's what, and we just have to accept we cannot ever understand why, but I think quantum mechanics will help us to understand at least how things are working. And I cannot wait for that to come more to the forefront, more um, to be more integrated, because I think a lot of what's out there already confirms our experiences in the sense that it explains, yes, this can work because of this entanglement, there can be distance healing. That is a possibility because there is somehow some information field that might explain what is going on there. Not why, but at least it helps us understanding. And so I believe quantum physics will tremendously help as a field of psychology, psychotherapy open up.
Thank you for that. Kristi, your thoughts?
Yeah, I was going to say, I definitely, feel a lot more hopeful in terms of the direction of where everything is moving in terms of, therapy, research that's being done, all of that. And is there a little bit of a lag, to get caught up with certain things? But I think, as Norman said, when we think about paradigm shifts, again, there can be the time for there to be the lag, before the catch up. And, it can be difficult when there's been this certain way of belief or this belief system around this is how things are. And I think that more and more people are having experiences. There's more and more people that are doing research. There's more people that are willing to educate about their experiences and the research they're doing. And so just with all of that, it definitely helps me to feel much more hopeful in the direction that we're going. And even podcasts like this, conferences, universities doing research, just all of that is, very helpful and, part of the paradigm shift. I think that, is definitely happening. And I think too, I often talk with, clients, whether therapy clients or coaching clients or whatever the case is, about the concept of both and. And Norman even made reference to that yes, these things are, can and are being explained in scientific ways. And it's equally as important, I would say, as the experience that people are having. And we may not have, a scientific way for everything that we're experiencing, but that doesn't take away our experience and what we know we've experienced, whether it's, someone that's had a near-death experience or an after death communication or psychic opening or out of body experience or and all of those things. So I, would just say I definitely feel hopeful about the direction we're going and with research, education, teaching, all of that. And I think that's why, we're all needed to help with educating people about these experiences are real, validating and I think too, just to go back a little bit, I just add this and then I'll stop about, we've talked a lot about with, as our work with clients and individuals about the importance of validating, acknowledging, creating a safe space. But I think there's also, the importance where we talk about how individuals, unfortunately and sadly, can be pathologized, that we also explore what their experiences are. What does that mean for you? What is happening? Really being aware of differential diagnosis and not to automatically, pathologize. Yes, we can validate, we can educate, but I think to explore, to really understand and make sure that we're not assuming that someone's having auditory or visual hallucinations, or it's psychosis or schizophrenia. Yes, that very well may be the case, but I think that really falls on us to really know how to be able to differentiate that. So I think it just ties in with everything, kind of your question about the direction things are going, and hopefully there'll be a not so much of a lag with everything that's happening now.
I know, right? It's interesting how paradigms, like it does seem to take science over 100 years to make a shift. And like you said, I'm glad we have more organizations now. It's like, wait, we have an internet. Do we really need 100 years to make a paradigm shift? Clearly, we're already on 120 years since the quantum science has been out there, and at the same time, psychology seems to have deaf ears for any of it. How I would like us for a moment to talk about how we do differentiate. I know for me, I remember one time in my office, this woman brought a neighbor boy. I'm not sure how that came about, but she brought a neighbor boy. I'm thinking he was about 15. And it was interesting because if I was listening to some of the content of the words that were coming out, they probably brought him to me because it sounded spiritual. And they were probably like, is this just spiritual? But it was very clear to me that he had lost his ability to connect. I mean, we can break our brain, and drugs can break our brain. And it really felt like it was more word salad because he couldn't really differentiate between, he couldn't navigate a rational linear conversation. There wasn't like a rational discourse that was happening. It was more like I might say something and then there was an associative launch. Not that I haven't done that myself, but you know what I mean? I mean, it was really clearly that there was not a conversation happening. And so I did have to refer and say, I think something more severe and serious is going on. I would like to have you guys tell the audience, like, how do you differentiate between when someone is really talking about real connections, real after death connections, real, I do see dead people, I do see shadow people, I do hear things, I hear my dead husband. And then when it moves into hallucination or delusion. So,
and that's where I was kind of touching on that a little bit earlier, where I think it's crucial to our evaluation, our information gathering in terms of, and comparing that with criteria, out of the DSM, but really evaluating and asking them, what are they experiencing? How long have they been experiencing? If they're seeing their deceased husband or loved ones, how do you feel when that happens? What, really being curious. And again, I keep saying part of the evaluation process, but that's what I feel is so crucial, because and how often is this happening? Has this been happening your whole life? For some people, and me as well, in terms of spiritual awakenings can happen so many, can be caused or can happen because of so many different reasons. It's not uncommon with grief when things can happen when they lose someone, then all of a sudden they start feeling them or sensing them, and people can be hesitant to talk about that, or I'm probably making this up, or maybe I'm crazy. Those are things people will say, but I had this experience. So I really think it's important to be very thorough. Let me be specific or emphasize that. Thorough in our evaluation, in our questioning, in our desire to understand what their experience is and how it's impacting them. So with that being said, again, back to the both and, I think there can be times where people may be experiencing a spiritual awakening and they also could be experiencing some mental health conditions at the same time. And so I think it's important. It could be either or it could be both and. And I think what I would say is it's really crucial to evaluate, assess, ask questions, be curious. How long has this been happening? Is there a family history of schizophrenia, psychosis, things of that nature? Is there alcohol and drugs involved? Have they had a psychedelic, experience recently? I mean, it's really crucial to look at all of the aspects. How, are they sleeping? What's their, how often, or how is their appetite? I mean, there can be so much overlap. So to summarize it, I'll just say, I think it's crucial with evaluation, history taking, meaning making, what they're experiencing has impacting them. Do they have other family members that may be intuitive that have these abilities and or mental health history? So that's really, I mean, again, crucial, and to hopefully prevent, what so many people have experienced of being, automatically maybe, hospitalized in psychiatric hospitals and started on antipsychotics or whatever the case is, versus let's really look at an overall history of what is going on here.
I really appreciate the detail that you gave in the answer, right? I think the detail is really important for other therapists who are learning how to navigate this realm. Norman, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yes, definitely. I like the curiosity aspect. I think that's always a good starting point. Open-minded, approaching things open-minded and with curiosity. Now, to just bring a simple example, if somebody comes and says, well, I see white mice running around on the floor all the time. Well, chances are that might be psychosis. Um, Unless, of course, 5 people before have reported we do see these white mice running around on this floor. They're actually ghosts of white mice. But that would be the context where we have to be curious, as Kristi said so rightly. So there's some things that seem more obvious. If somebody says, and another case from the correctional facility comes to my mind, if somebody says, I'm drinking because I hear the voice of my deceased son, we know we're dealing with something else. Somebody who misunderstood what they're hearing in their or perceiving in their head. Because when you then ask, which I did, well, what kind of message are you hearing? And they're saying, well, he's telling me that he's fine, he's okay, and well, that is not a psychosis. So we can see that sometimes easily. I think where things get really difficult, and I'll only quickly touch on that because we won't have the time to get into that here, is when it comes to possible possession. Now, and I know even the founders and the top level IFS people have accidentally encountered what they call external parts. I've read a huge book on that, and it's super interesting. It's called The Others Within Us. And so if somebody with a drug problem or alcohol problem comes and reports he feels like he's not themselves, then whether we believe in this or not, we can work with that framework of such an external part. And some psychiatrists have even done that in psychiatric hospitals and been very successful with that. And again, therapists don't have to work with beliefs. We just have to approach everything open, curious, and work with a framework that is there. So what I'm saying here is essentially, sometimes if you're encountering something that it might be psychosis to you, but then again, it might not be, or you're really not sure, talk to someone like you, Valerie, or Kristi, or myself, who has perhaps experience or knowledge or both of these type of experiences. So, and I guess some basic training um, in in transpersonal matters. We call transpersonal everything that goes beyond the mind, that is trans the personal. And you can obviously, and I think all three of us are probably on the directory of IAMS, of trained mental health professionals. If you encounter this, contact somebody who has been trained in this, and do not assume everything where somebody hears or sees something you can perceive that this is psychosis. In many cases, it's not. In some cases, it might be. And that's why we need this knowledge.
I
Yes,
just
this
wanted
is so
to
important. Yeah, Kristi.
Sorry, I just wanted to add real quick. When you said that, Norman, it gave me this example, just to give a real quick example too. How important it is the context of what they're experiencing. Just like you said, is it a deceased relative? But it made me think of a client I worked with in community mental health, and he actually was diagnosed with psychosis, or I'm sorry, with schizophrenia. He was on medication. He was mostly fully functional, but I'll say this, he would report to me, and this is just, to kind of differential diagnosis in terms of he would see talking snakes. And he would tell me, I know they're not real. So he was aware enough to know they weren't real, but they were talking snakes and they were saying rude, mean things to him. He would also tell me he could see a little leprechaun talking to him. He would tell me, I know they're not real. Obviously, they were looking at his medications and things of that nature, but he was aware they weren't real. And when I say the context, it was not only what he was seeing, but it was the context of it. The talking snake saying very, mean things to him. I also don't know if they were encouraging him to harm himself in some way. So again, we know that that's going to be very, different than somebody having a spiritually transformative experience or transpersonal experience versus, again, there was a lot more context to that, but I just wanted to give that differential to where it's like what Norman said, it's the context, it's, just really exploring more of what are they saying, how are you feeling based on receiving these things, I think is really important too.
Well, and I'm glad that Norman, that you brought up possession. It's funny that you bring that up because I literally have just been through a huge synchronicity where apparently the universe was trying to really update me on possession. And it was one thing after another. It was an interesting synchronicity where I'm at I'll skip the 21 things, let's say, and I'll just say a few of the milestones, like a fear of psi symposium, where they're really discussing fear of psi and how it's influencing the science, but fear of psi also because of religiosity, because the devil made me do it, or things like that. And then actual, like, what about entities, and if benevolent beings exist, malevolent beings likely exist. And then how do we tell the difference between that and someone telling us, oh, and I know it's not real, because they're humoring us. They know that they're supposed to say that. Anyway, there was a whole thing, and it led to this other person talking to me like she didn't want to hear this medium because she was afraid that all mediums are of the devil because of the religiosity training. And I'll just say this weird 3 weeks of synchronicity culminated all of a sudden in a client of mine who, I first knew her when she was, a young teen in my office, and who could see dead people and wanted helpful hints how to make Uncle Joey quit appearing in her bedroom, let's say. And then the technique I gave her worked real well. So we went on to other topics to helping her go through, Harvard training for divinity school. And she's a reverend. And then next thing you know, she's coming to me for what she's like, this just seems weird. And it seems more like as if I have a phobia, and I don't know how I got this phobia related to car and driving that came out of the blue. But bottom line is, by the end of it, she felt like she was being influenced by Beelzebub, who had just come up in all the synchronicities. And so I knew what to do with that. And next thing you know, I'm saying, okay, you're a reverend. Let's lead you through the very cleansing that you would do for your spiritual people. And I had her lead the depossession session, if you will, for her, and to remove any entity and what does it want and what have you. And then to also do it for the car non-locally. And interesting how that seemed to make the problem go away, and I remember at an ICEME conference way back when in Denver, there was the International Society for the Study of Subtle Energy and Energy Medicine. And essentially, there was a compassionate depossession workshop, and it was a trained psychiatrist psychiatrist. He was working for a state mental hospital, and he was giving a workshop on how to lead clients through compassionate depossession. And the case before us was a woman who had been diagnosed her entire life with bipolar and was now in the state hospital. But he began to suspect that it was entity related. And we watched as several benign entities ended up leaving her body. I mean, one was a grandmother she never knew, that apparently when she was born and was going through such trauma, apparently the grandmother decided it would be her job to step in and to help protect this person. Another apparently was a little boy down the block who was killed at a young age and thought she just looked like a nice little girl and so stepped in. And so it does speak to when we are psychically open and we don't know how to create energetic boundaries, we might get entity attachments, but it's not like the movies necessarily. It's just like Norman said, they will commonly say things like, it doesn't feel like mine. I feel this anger and it doesn't feel like mine. I feel depression energy and it doesn't feel like mine. That's like a sign.
And and that's where an internal family systems approach will work very gently with these parts. So as opposed to some priest saying, leave this body or something like that, there will be more of a gentle negotiation with external parts and offering them an easier, smoother way out. But again, that is a whole different topic, but it's a good illustration of why it's so important for us to be open to this dimension that we know that exists, because we might, instead of pumping somebody full of pharmaceuticals, be able to help them rid themselves of some parts. And even if anyone, let's say of the viewers here or anyone else would think, oh, I don't believe this exists. But you know what? If that is the framework for that person, that there's something external uh, for them, why not work with that? Why not? Wouldn't it be almost malpractice not to work with that and with their framework and help them coax that out? Because if you believe in it or not, that is the framework, and it might help surprisingly well if you're curious and open to this.
And as we go into our last question, just any further thoughts type of question, uh, we can also say that, like you said, it doesn't really matter what we as therapists believe. It's like we need to respect what is the position of our client. And in some ways, even if it works like a placebo effect, and for people who have fear of this, most of it, it's not like the movies and it doesn't look scary. And like Norman was saying, it's not like these loud exorcisms like in the Exorcist movies and what have you. Even with my client, it was more of a prayer and it was more a command and it was gentle. And it's the idea that we have free will, apparently, is what we are taught. We have free will, and that is what sets up the energetic for our boundary. If we know that no other entities are allowed in this body, then no other entities are allowed in this body. On the other hand, if we welcome step-ins and all these other things, apparently we leave the door open. So when we don't believe, we can just make sure we're closed, if you will. Any last thoughts before we close for today? Anything that you maybe feel like the viewers need to be left with?
I think I would like to leave the last word on that to Kristi, because I think she probably has even more to say than I have. I would just encourage everyone to read a little bit NDE stories, for example, or other stories that can give you hope for what comes after, because it can help you with grief, it can help you with your own life transition challenges, to read the experiences of near-death experiencers. And for therapists, I'd say just validate, stay open, be curious, and educate yourself, and when necessary, refer out. And I want to thank you a lot, Valerie, for this conversation. Kristi, over to you.
Perfect timing. There was some more noise again. I hope y'all can't hear it.
We
But
cannot.
great, great. Yeah, that's all great, Norman. And I would reiterate a lot of the same is for, any individuals who are experiencing circumstances that they're confused about or they're trying to make sense of, that there are resources available. There are, therapists that are available, whether it's searching websites like IANS and, people who are trained to be able to help you. But to know and not, discount your experiences when it's, oh, I may be making this up or whatever the case is. Like there's research, there's websites, there's guides, there's therapists, there's organizations, there's sharing circles. There's ways to connect, to continue to learn and to make more sense and meaning of what you're experiencing and to have it be validated. So, I just want to say that there's lots of resources out there. There's lots of books, like Norman said. What I would say as far as for mental health professionals, again, to tack on to what Norman said is, again, remain open, stay curious. If there's experiences, just like, when a client comes to us with anything that maybe it's something we haven't heard of before, be willing to be curious and explore and, to do research or do what you need to make sure that you're, remaining, you're remaining open, you're, showing empathic care. If you need to consult with other professionals or you do need to refer out if it's, out of your scope of practice, that it's okay and important to be able to know what our own limitations are as well, so we can make sure that we're serving clients, to the best of our ability and providing ethical care. So those would be just the main things that I would say, and just, the wonderful world of all of the transpersonal experiences that we can have, being open, embracing them, continuing to be open to talk and share and teach about them. And Valerie, I just really appreciate the opportunity to talk about all the different topics we covered today. So thank you so much. And Norman, you as well.
Oh, and you both are so welcome. And I thank you because, like you said, we are a minority, a growing minority, but a minority nonetheless when we kind of specialize in dealing with these transpersonal concerns. And it's just been a delight being able to speak with you. And one more time, I'm going to say that if you want to connect with Norman, he's at normanclownig.com, and I will also have that in writing when I post this video. And Kristi, kristiotis.com or friendswoodcc.com. So thank you guys so much.